Hi, everyone. Hello. As everyone looks up from their phones. Hi. Welcome to this session. Thank you so much for joining us. I know this is the last session of the afternoon, and if you've had a cross-Atlantic flight like I have, it's now your bedtime. So thanks for staying awake for this one. I'm Sara Custer. I'm the editor of THE Campus, which is Times Higher Education's new platform for research sharing for academics and university staff all around the world to give advice to each other about things like online teaching and learning, how to do equity, diversity, and inclusion, good internationalization strategies, and how to progress the SDGs. If you want to find out more about that, it's at timeshighereducation.com/campus. Now, on to our panel. As everyone in this room probably knows, universities proved one thing in the past 2 years, and that is about how they can pivot and how they can be adaptable and really responsive whenever they need to be. They're now undergoing a massive digital transformation. Another thing that we've learned is that students know how to learn online. They're ready for it. There's a strong demand for online degrees. And in 2020, there were more, let me get this right, there were more undergraduates pursuing a certificate or an associate degree than a bachelor's degree. So what next? How do we merge these two worlds of institutions who are undergoing a digital transformation, a huge demand for short courses, and then a lot of alternative providers who are on the scene? So that's what we will be discussing in the next 38 minutes. So let me introduce you to our panel. We have Tade Oyerinde, who is the CEO of Campus. We have Rasmussen, who is the CEO of Outlier.org. Danny King is the co-founder and CEO of Accredible. David Garza is the president of Tecnologico de Monterrey. And we have Philipp Schmidt, who is the director of the Digital Learning Lab, Digital Learning and at the MIT Media Lab. Thank you so much for joining us. So, one thing that I didn't mention in my opening statement was the word micro-credentials. And that's where I'd like our panelists to start. It's just telling us a little bit about how they understand micro-credentials. What are they and what does it mean to them? Tade, I'm going to go to you first.
Sure. I think the simplest way I think of micro-credentials would be, if we think about a degree, there's these somewhat artificial, somewhat useful expectations of 4-year or 2-year, but there should probably be more small ways to measure what students learn in higher education. I think any of those smaller certificates or badges that people can basically point at and say, oh, you understand X concept, those are micro-credentials.
Aaron, how would you define a micro-credential?
I mean, that was such an excellent definition. There's not a lot left there. Yeah, it's really anything less than a full degree unit in the ability to prove that you know a skill, potentially to an employer, but potentially also to further your education. So we certainly think more in the concept of sort of stackable micro-credentials. So kind of the basic unit might be, a 3 or 4 Carnegie unit course. And that's sort of the original micro-credential in a way, and less than that and more than that. This is going to get harder and harder. Good luck, you guys.
Hi, everybody. I'm going to take a broader, so we've got about 1,600 customers, and each one probably defines a micro-credential as something a little different. Our customers all issue digital credentials. But I think if there's some broad consensus, it's something that isn't in itself maybe career advancing or something you'd put on your resume itself, but if you bundle them together in aggregate, they can be sort of much more than the sum of their parts.
Hi, it seems that it's going to be a stackable definition of micro-credentials. But let me tell you about, even building on what you just said, actually within the university, we have different definitions and different approaches to micro-credential. It was until a couple of months ago that we tried to assemble a common definition of what we mean by micro-credential. But very quickly, I would say that micro-credential, it's a record of achievement of either some knowledge, some skills, or some abilities. And it is something that is of value for a third party, for an external stakeholder. It's something that you can actually verify that there are certain standards, and there has been some assessment associated to what it's supposed to be achieved with that micro-credential. I think that there are other attributes that we are seeing related to micro-credentials, but perhaps for that I will comment later on during the panel.
So maybe since everyone has already defined what a micro-credential is, maybe I'll say a couple of things about what I find interesting about micro-credentials. Because if they are just small pieces of traditional credentials, I don't find them particularly interesting. I think what makes them special is if they either create new opportunities, so maybe in a space where you needed a formal credential in the past, now with the micro-credential or a number of micro-credentials, you can unlock that opportunity, or where they create new pathways into formal education. And maybe one thing where it'd be interesting to kind of dig a little deeper is, like, in my opinion, one micro-credential can be very meaningful. I mean, MIT issues, and so does Tech, micromasters credentials, and people get jobs with them, and we would consider them micro-credentials.
Thank you for that. One question I have, just around, it seems like the world of micro-credentials is ever expanding, and it's probably confusing for students, and I'm sure it's confusing for employers and the people who should care about these micro-credentials, and for them to have any sort of currency wherever students decide to take them. David, this is something that you mentioned in your comment about them having a purpose and kind of having a meaning. How do we make sure that there is some sort of validity to any of these micro-credentials that students are now undertaking?
I think that there are two aspects of that validity. To me, the most important is that it's something that is of value for someone else, not just internally for yourself, but there is either an employer or another stakeholder that considers that valuable. We are seeing, for example, that in the area of technology, I mean, it's very important. It's a very important opportunity there for the micro-credential aspect. The other aspect, it has to do with the trust in the issuer of the micro-credential. Because now we are facing a world where there is David's Academy that is providing some micro-credential, which I would say that that's not bad. I mean, I think that that's good. That the fact that you have that ecosystem growing, but somehow you will like to have some verifiability of, well, if this says that it's a project manager level 1, what does that mean, and what has been achieved, and what's the evidence that there is some type of learning or skills associated with those micro-credentials. And finally, I would say that perhaps we associate the micro-credential with the learning experience and the issue of the micro-credential. I think that perhaps, yes, so far, that's the way that we find it in many places, but I think that that can also be the couple. I mean, the learning can happen somewhere else, and the issue of the micro-credential can be by another person that actually makes the assessment and guarantees that there are certain skills or abilities that have been developed.
Tade, go ahead, and then Daniel, I'll come to you.
Sure. Well, I think one interesting dynamic to consider is we already have a pretty well-established sort of trust sort of entity. It's called accreditation. There's regional accreditation in the United States, and even with MIT, I don't know exactly what the sort of atomic unit of your micro-credentials are, but generally speaking, if you're working within the walls of accreditation, there are pretty robust standards that are associated with all of these micro-credentials. I think Aaron, at Outlier, your whole model is similar to ours in that you operate within the confines of accreditation. And one interesting debate, I think, for the future of micro-credentials is, do we need to continue to play along within sort of this friendly world of accreditation, sort of very friendly to innovation all of the time? And that's sarcasm. But at the same time, is extremely useful for quality assurance. We've seen lots of examples for anyone who's paying attention, particularly in the boot camp space, of entities who were very aggressive to get out to market, very aggressive to market to students, generally were well-meaning people, but did not ultimately create products that had standards that were anywhere close to what you'd get at a traditional accredited four-year or two-year university. And so that's one interesting question is how do you all think about accreditation and how that affects the validity of these micro-credentials? Do we need something new, or does accreditation work?
Well, I think for me, when we've seen micro-credentials work really well, it's not a lack of sort of trust or respect for the institution. You know, like Tec de Monterrey, arguably the sort of leaders in South America of issuing these micro-credentials, and they have a very sort of well-known positive reputation. It's more a confusion. An employer is looking at this and they're not really sure what it is, and they're not used to the term micro-credential or sort of what that means. So I think where we've seen it work best is when on the credential itself, you can articulate what did it take to earn this credential. Maybe you can outline what the syllabus was or sort of tag it with relevant skills and why you can trust that this credential sort of embodies those things. So that's one of the benefits of digital credentials, because you can sort of communicate that on the credential itself, and that's when we've seen it work the best.
So yeah, in regards to, do we need sort of accreditation? Well, it's certainly done a lot to kind of keep the university system stable and give it a lot of longevity over the years and protect, the liberal arts degree, which I'm a huge fan of. It's part of what we are trying to make sure is still accessible. But outside of that, in micro-credentialing, we already have some accrediting bodies, but they don't sound the way we're used to. It's not HLC or Middle States, it's Google, right? It's Cisco, it's Microsoft. And these have been around for quite some time, and they've shown a lot of power in what they can do. And this is a pretty fascinating crossover moment that we're seeing. I mean, we're talking about the future of higher education post-pandemic, and we've already sort of started to drift into this concept of something that, I don't know, you wouldn't ordinarily put under higher education, right? A much more sort of trade-specific or job-specific credential. And, I'm certainly one to step far back from that and, ask if that is the direction we all want this to go. Because it's certainly a direction it can go. And, to Tade's point about the boot camps, I think there are well-intentioned people that it went kind of sideways. And I think I've run into cynical people, too, that simply don't think college education should matter and have found ways to make it not matter and, give that piece of paper. And I think that's a real tragedy and something that we do need to keep in mind in the system of education, is you will have bad actors. It's like anywhere else.
Just talking about where this sits in a traditional higher education landscape, and David and Philipp, as our kind of residential institutional representatives on the panel, I'm going to ask you this first. How do you see this fitting? If we have people like Outlier, Campus.org, or edX, or Coursera giving out credentials, how do you see this fitting, and how should institutions, I mean, David, you already kind of have done this, but how should institutions be responding to this growing demand for short courses and credentials?
Well, I think that in higher education, many universities, we come from the model of immersive 4-year education. That model, in my opinion, will continue existing for many, many years. However, I think that, and especially now with the pandemic, what we saw is that we can reach a larger population that perhaps does not have certain skills. And we have to remember that there is this huge need for upskilling and reskilling in many areas. So on top of having this 4-year immersion program, the opportunity to have like free flow programs where the student comes and goes at different points of time, I see it as an opportunity for many universities to actually expand our impact. At the end of the day, that's what we're trying to do, to have some impact on society. Now, the fact that there are some players in this landscape that are not traditional universities, I think that the approach that we're following is how we can make some synergies, what are the things that they can do better than what we can do. I mentioned earlier that perhaps we need to decouple the fact of the learning experience, the teaching and learning experience, from the issue of the credential. And it might be as well that there is a third-party option that provides better learning experience, but that we can actually provide a micro-credential that level of what we expect in terms of quality has been achieved. So I see it as in that way. I see that, of course, we are at a point, and perhaps making also a comment related to this accreditation aspect. I see that we will need some sort of flexibility in this time where we are, where let's say that the ecosystem is building. Because if we try to put some restrictions very early, we might actually hinder the potential innovation that we can have here. So, in summary, I would say that try to find some synergies with the things that you can find complementary.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think we are very excited about innovation in this space, and it's great to see lots of new organizations, lots of new formats, lots of new models. I think I also agree that the 4-year or 6-year higher education experience is not going to go away. But I also think it's not the experience for the majority anymore. Already today, most people do not have that experience. Maybe they start and stop, or maybe they do a few years here, then they work for 10 years, and they come back for a master's or something. So I think that's just, the world has already changed, and the higher education institutions are catching up. And for us, this is a huge opportunity. I mean, just one example, the MicroMaster I mentioned before. The supply chain MicroMasters was the first one that MIT launched. 450,000 people have signed up for one of the courses. 50,000 people have completed one of the courses. And 4,000 people have gotten the full MicroMaster, which is for, I think, 5 online courses and a proctored exam. 4,000 people have received that full credential. MIT only graduates about 4,000 people a year. So, we're now able to reach a much, much larger group of students who maybe will never, either don't want to come to MIT, we can't host that many people on campus. It's a way for us to open up and serve many, many more students. I think it's super complementary to what lots of other people are doing. And to some degree also, I think it's up to the universities to compete out there in the market, right? Like, we got to be innovative, we have to change. And I am confident that we have things to offer that are of extremely high quality. There's a lot of demand for education in general, and the more the merrier. The more innovation, the more flexibility, the more models.
I'm interested to hear from the tech side of things now. Where do you guys see yourselves fitting in the traditional 4-year landscape? And does it worry you to hear people like Philipp say, we're doing this stuff, we're already doing it? What happens if every university kind of cracks this nut and figures it out? Are you worried that just creates more competition for what you're trying to do? Tade, let's start.
Well, no, I think that the more the merrier. I think that what we're focused on is really access. And so if you think about today, what are your options for learning from a professor at a UCLA, an NYU, a Princeton, and MIT? Well, you really pretty much have the only option of going to those schools. I think that MOOCs, theoretically, were supposed to give us access, but I think we're learning that you probably need more than just being one of a million people in a MOOC to actually get that Socratic exchange with these faculty. And so at campus.org, what we do is we say, okay, we're going to hire a bunch of these adjuncts from these top schools, and work with our partner institution to have them teach courses for credit, and you can stack them into an associate's degree. And then the beauty of I think the sort of micro-credential opportunity here is that associate's degree can transfer into a bachelor's degree. And I think that whilst many of us would love to see a world where degrees didn't matter, the fact is they do. My sister started dating a guy recently, and the first question my mother asks is, where do you go to college? And that still matters. It's still, in this country, an important credential that signals that you have a certain level of persistence, of conscientiousness, of intelligence. And so I think the ideal world, I agree with, with some of our traditional folks who have been saying, I don't think the bachelor's degree goes away. I don't think that masters and PhDs go away. I do think that most of the innovation that's going to happen over the next 10 years is probably going to be in the associates or sort of micro-credential space, where the product that students are traditionally buying is less robust. When you go to MIT, theoretically you want the 4-year campus experience. You want the dining halls, and you want the 4 a.m. debates over whiskey about the future.
You definitely don't want the dining halls.
But you want the full bundle of products that you're getting that we call a bachelor's degree. At the associate's level, I think there's already, where we're seeing a large willingness to give up a lot of that to reduce the cost. And so more than half of undergraduates today start off at community colleges. In the state of Texas, it's 70% of all undergraduates today started off at community colleges. And so I think we'll see more of that continue.
Fully agree. I think the more the merrier. I mean, what an amazing world if every college cracked this, and we have MicroMasters in all sorts of different things. I mean, our mission is access to high quality higher education and reducing student debt. So having that optionality for students would be incredible. Now, when it comes to innovation at the associates level, there is a lot of room there at the moment, especially to make it less expensive. And I think what's really exciting for us when we think about kind of micro-credentials and the stackable pathway to a bachelor's is some courses really lend themselves well to those, scalable online solutions. Our online courses that are fully scalable have the same pass rates as in-person courses. Now, it takes us an incredibly long time to make those, lots of money, and then lots of student support, right? So it's definitely not easy. It's a huge investment. However, what that means is you can give students a tool set for, call it the first 2 years. You can do a 2+2, and they end up in the second 2 years of bachelor's degree and get that Socratic experience and get that seminar-based learning and maybe 4 a.m. whiskey and regretful dining hall foxhole buddy meals. So with us, we just announced this deal with Amazon, and Amazon is fully funding 750,000 of their students to take one of our micro-credentials, which is a college pathway credential. And it's interesting because it's a credential, but it's made of 4 3-credit courses. Mm-hmm. So this allows a student to figure out, what do they want to do? Are they interested in economics or business or, give writing skills, sociology, psychology? There's some optionality in there. Mm-hmm. While not building up student debt and gaining stackable credits. So it's interesting because that's a micro-credential that we'll see how Amazon sort of treats that internally as an atomic unit. But as a pathway unit, it's a very real thing because those credits, we work with the University of Pittsburgh, those credits will transfer everywhere from, we found out recently, Princeton and Harvard and Georgetown, all the way to community colleges, et cetera, which is really where we focus. We're not focused on the top 100. So I think when we also think about micro-credentials and we also think about the university model, the question is who pays for it? Mm-hmm. Because the university, frequently will have government funds and student funds. And now we're starting to see this education as a benefit, extraordinary revolution happening, where you can go and work at a company and get the equivalent of like a GI Bill and actually complete your degree through working at a company. And I think that is an extraordinary innovation, but will lead to different kind of concepts of what that education is. Whereas we want there to be just a diversity of approach in education, where some's being funded government, some's direct to consumer. We actually started direct to consumer. We just said, hey, we'll make the best thing we can. We can't take financial aid, so sign up for it. So I think that concept of the source of the funding for these credentials and the price of the credentials is going to have a huge effect on what works and what works for the student.
That is powerful. Congratulations on the deal, by the way. For me, it comes down to specialization. Universities, historically, it used to be you get your degree and that would set you up for life and that was your career, a few decades ago. And nowadays, when you graduate with a degree, it's more like a sort of broad entry-level sort of foundation that you then build upon over a career. That's sort of what you were talking about there with the learning will stay throughout your life. And so specialization isn't, in my opinion, the job of the universities. Sure, you specialize in, say, computer science or nursing or marketing, but that actually still is not enough anymore. You don't hire I did computer science, so you don't hire a computer scientist. You hire, an AWS backend engineer or a Google Cloud Platform backend engineer. And so that's where, it's this beautiful sort of synergy, I think, between, if you have, a Tec de Monterrey computer science degree and this Google certification, which is a specialization, and that Google specialization has the rigor, thanks to partnering with, say, a university, that synergy is really powerful. But the sort of real power and benefit of a degree is this broad, rigorous foundation that can then be built upon, and that's not going away anytime soon.
I would like to give you guys an opportunity to ask our panel a question or two. I do have one more for them, so please get your brain gears working to think of those questions. But the first one, or my question actually, is just about the public policy environment that these micro-credentials are existing in, and if it's robust enough. And I know, David, that Mexico is a slightly different thing, and I want you to tell us about that. But are those structures in place to allow government funding for micro-credentials, or the support of them, or greater acceptance of them among employers or different education institutions? Is that there? And what needs to change in order for it to get there? David, let's start with you to hear the Mexico experience, and then we can go to the rest of the panelists.
Yes, and even if I expand to the Latin America region, like, for example, there is a big challenge in Latin America. There are over 10,000 universities in Latin America. There is an issue related to quality in terms of the different university ecosystem, and the access, of course, is much lower than what you have here in the States. So there is a big opportunity in Latin America, in Mexico, talking more about Mexico. I think that there should be some incentives for the development of this ecosystem, and there should be also some flexibility related to the regulations that are related to whether or not you can transfer credits that you have earned through a micro-credential and things like that. So those are I would say, the main topics where we will need to see some advance, or at least not getting into the way or making an obstacle for advancing into the micro-credential landscape.
Well, this is less about regulation and more about the enforceability of it. One thing I will say is I think there is actually quite a lot of regulation around things like what a credential is and what's sort of deemed as a credential, especially in places like Europe. But I will say that even with that, I think there's a deeper problem, which is there's a lot of credential fraud, like a lot more than you would think. So the study that I'd like to point to is this incredible study that ADP put out every year. ADP is the largest payroll processing company in the world, I think, and they handle about 1/6 of all payroll for Americans. They also, though, run a background checking subdivision, and that background checking division does like 3 million background checks a year. And so they publish statistics on what they see in those background checks every year. 23% of resumes were found to have a fraudulent credential on it. 23%. Right? That's probably a couple of orders magnitude more than you think. So even if there is a regulatory environment, we need to make it way easier, like it should be a click of a button, to check, wait a minute, what is this credential for? Is it legitimate? Has it expired? So I think that regardless of the legal vehicle that we have there, we do actually need to make sure that you can't essentially lie about your credentials.
If I can comment real quick on that point, actually, that's also a big problem in countries in Latin America. I mean, in Mexico, we moved towards blockchain diplomas for undergraduate degrees on top of their traditional paper diploma because of this issue of that many employers and were calling us to see if the diploma was actually the original, the real one, if the people graduated from our school. So now we moved towards the blockchain, and that was even before pandemic. Now with the pandemic, the students appreciated this even more because during graduation, that's what they receive in their cell phones, a blockchain version of the diploma.
Philipp, did you want to come in there?
Yeah, actually, this is a partnership between MIT and the Tech and 10 other universities called the Digital Credentials Consortium, where we are trying to build an infrastructure that allows this kind of verification of digital credentials. But the key point there is it's built on open standards, because one thing we haven't really talked about is interoperability. Right? Like this idea of Stackable is great, but if I can't get these things out of one system and then add them into another system, it's all still a little bit cumbersome. And so I think interoperability and open standards are really important and are going to drive this, this ecosystem, which then creates business opportunities. And for the policy sector, I think there is some interesting stuff happening, but one thing I would love to see is for the US government to say, if your students want to access federal funding, then every credit that you issue has to be issued as a verifiable credential, a W3C standard verifiable credential, which means it's automatically digital, it's portable, the students own it, and that would completely, it actually wouldn't change anything about funding. It would still be, to your point, like existing systems of accreditation and quality assurance would completely change the digital credentials ecosystem and landscape.
Does anybody want to tackle my policy question, Aaron?
It's a big question you've got there. I mean, I think Tade is the same way. We're pretty focused on the Carnegie unit and the traditional accreditation system. So it's a little bit outside my ken to understand the sort of credentialing system beyond a brand, which we do think of that. So when it comes to micro credentials, it's yeah. I don't know if you got anything to.
Yeah, no, I think that it's kind of like what you said earlier. A lot of what's important about accreditation is access to federal funds. And I think that if I had a magic wand, what I would like to see would essentially be the current system, except that it's a bit easier to get accredited. The challenge is that it's so impossibly difficult to create a new university or a new community college in less than 10 years. It just takes a long time, and there's all these archaic structures. There has to be a site visit where people are inspecting your campus, but what if you're online? And we've seen some national accreditors try and simplify the process, but then they're not interoperable with the regional accreditors. Regional accreditation is what you want. It's what pretty much every university that we're familiar with has. And so if I had a magic wand, it would be to talk to the 5-6 regional accreditors and say, can we create a 2 or 3 year pathway for new institutions to get accredited, to demonstrate that they adhere to the standards of accreditation? I don't think it's as broken as people think. I think it just needs to be 30 or 40% faster, and I think you'd see an explosion of innovation. I think part of why accreditation is important is there are grifters. We don't want to see the Theranos University, sort of duping students out of their federal funds. And I do think that having a bit of a moat around the system, healthcare, education, these are important things. I think that's useful, but it doesn't need to be as arbitrary as it is, and it definitely needs to be more accessible to people who have funds. I mean, even Elon Musk is joking on Twitter about starting a new college, and I'm like, yeah, you don't have what it takes. You can't pull it off. It's so hard, and I think it should be probably a little bit easier.
Any questions from anyone? Raise your hand. Yeah, if you could just maybe stand up and tell us who you are and shout or speak loudly, please.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Furman. I'm currently in grad school and started a nonprofit in DC. I'm curious about the state of awarding credit for learning and having in the workplace. Aaron, you mentioned this question of education as a benefit and employers playing a role here. But I'm curious what you see as sort of like moving the ball forward and innovating on that, especially if we can change the recognition for prior learning mechanism, which seems like a
Yeah, I would love to see there be more pathways for essentially, you're talking about accrediting prior experience. So this is a frequent problem for people who have enlisted in the military, get tons of experience, come back, and it's not very easy to translate some of those experiences into something that an employer recognizes or maybe a university recognizes, et cetera. I think that there is a really good opportunity right now to have somebody come up with a lot of great assessments for that, and you simply take an assessment that helps standardize what you've learned through those experiences. Already there's quite a few universities that will, on an individual basis, look at your prior work experience and be able to award credits for it. I think that's fantastic. But I'd love to see it sort of more similar to the CLEP, right? Where it's sort of like you just take the test. Now we know you know what we think you know. You prove what you know. And then you can add that into a stackable degree, et cetera. So huge opportunity there. Somebody please do it. Again, more competition, the better. Let's make this happen.
But then, sorry.
Let's go to Philipp first, and then Daniel will come to you.
Okay. Quick, Western Governors University does this already at scale, but the other one I would point you to is College Unbound. I'm on the board. We actually just went through accreditation. It was a complete pain. It took almost 10 years. But I think we are doing very interesting stuff with respect to recognition of prior learning. It's adult degree completion, basically.
There's this also rising trend of education as a benefit. Companies like Starbucks, I think Walmart, Uber, and others, where they're not accrediting you for prior experience, but because you're sort of getting a degree, even if you're a part-timer. I think Starbucks partnered with ASU, actually. I might be wrong about that, where you end up with like an ASU degree at the end of, I think working with them for some multiple number of years. And so, if you can start tracking it early, then you don't have to go and accredit for previous experience, and that's sort of easier for the universities to do.
I think there's also going to have to be some sort of government intervention here, because what we've seen from a lot of the proprietary for-profit higher education institutions is even if you've completed, call it English composition, at another institution, I don't like that they had you reading Macbeth. No. To try again, you have to take it here. Why? Well, because if you take more credits here, we charge more revenue and our business profits. And so I do think that whilst an idea around standardized assessments could help, we also will need the government to actually step in and say, if you score within X range on whatever standard assessment, then that's going to be accepted.
Can I comment real quick?
Please.
Also, I mean, related to this, let's say, use case that has been presented, there is one challenge that I see that applies not just to this case, and it has to do with the representation of the micro-credential. And usually what we are using is digital badges. But there is, as it was mentioned, I mean, to work more on the standards for, well, on top of that digital badge, you can have a digital badge that says, well, he has Java, full stack Java development micro-credential. But I think that it has to be associated the evidences that he has achieved that, through what competencies, who was the one that, or what was the environment where he actually achieved those type of skills. And so there, of course, now is very open. I mean, you have a representation that is just the badge. There are representations more complete where there is even more information. So that's something that we will need to advance as well.
Good, thank you. Any other questions? Yes?
On the micro-credential side, how do you think about standardization, if that's even applicable, around outcomes and success rates and return on investment? Maybe it totally varies based on the nature of the micro-credential, but at least in the accredited space, you have some framework to think about that. But how do you, from a consumer perspective, how do you convey that value and opportunity to potential students?
This one's a little bit of a toughie, but we've seen, we've worked with thousands of organizations that are sort of essentially trying to put a taxonomy on the skills that their credentials are then sort of contributing to. And what I think the struggle there is no, well, I was going to say no two organizations agree on the taxonomy, but it's not as simple, like there are some that do agree, but it's very, very hard to get two organizations to agree, just like you were saying, Tade, on, okay, what does this outcome actually mean? What I think is starting to emerge, though, is standards are emerging sort of just through the market forces of, well, this is what Google thinks these competencies are, and I'm just going to trust Google. Or, well, this is the Microsoft way, or, this is the American Nursing Association's definition. I think you'll start to see sort of camps around certain standards, and I think that's okay. I think it's probably maybe good to have competition on taxonomies, and we'll start to see those emerge and sort of groups coalesce around those.
Yeah, I mean, there's really two ways to go about this, and we keep coming back to brand, right? It's the brand of our, the University of Pittsburgh credits. Like, there's clearly a lot of oversight there. There's oversight in our assessments. People know that they can trust those. Or if it's what Google thinks was, good for micro-credential. The other way, so when you think back in time and you think about where brands came from, it's, okay, if I want to know a sword came from a particular blacksmith, maybe it's got that blacksmith's maker's mark on it, right? And that's the brand, you can trust that. Well, let's say it's gold now. And you could look at this gold and you could say, okay, this is the brand of gold. I know it to be high quality gold, so I trust it. Now the other thing you could do is the Archimedes style, and you drop it in some water, you weigh it, you look at its volume, and you say that's definitely gold because it's the right density for gold. So I think there's two ways that we're talking about here. One is the direct assessments. I mean, if you look at something like, CLEP, or you look at these other sort of more standardized tests, you're essentially figuring out the density of the gold and determining whether or not that's the gold without a brand, because you're looking at the assessment directly. Then the other way is to look at the brand. And I think we're so heavy on looking at brands at this point. And I think there's a lot to be said for that, because many things are very difficult to test directly. I mean, you think about the concept of writing a good essay. And we're getting there. Machine learning is getting to the point where we can start to give a directional sense of, is this a good essay or not? We're not there yet. A multiple choice test, however, we can. We can directly measure the gold. So I think to your question there, Mark, it's there are these two pathways, and I think that both should be pursued. And the brand side is already well pursued right now.
Tade, did you want to come in on that, or are you?
Well, yeah, I'm trying to think what I think about this sort of dichotomy between brand and direct assessment. I think that...
In 1 minute, just FYI.
I think part of it depends on what exactly you're trying to measure. If someone has a liberal arts degree, it's hard to understand how you assess a good essay. I mean, there's some of this stuff is very subjective. I think there are other fields where you have what I call these show your work competencies, where if you do it, like if you're a programmer, if you can code, you can code. Can you do it quickly? Can you do it at high quality? It's more easy to measure. And so it'll be interesting to see if institutions or systems conform to one of those two pathways, or if it breaks down on a subject-by-subject basis. But that'll be interesting to see.
Great. We will end it there. Thank you very much, panelists, for your very insightful conversation. Round of applause for them.